Alright, we've done the months, we've done the school subjects, we've done days of the week, we've done letters of the alphabet. This is it, we've hit the final video in this series, what color is each number? If you don't know what's going on, back in August of last year, I made a poll asking people to assign colors to several different topics, and then I analyzed that data in various ways. While there are a set number of letters, months, and days of the week to look at, there are an infinite number of, well, numbers. As such, this video is going to work a little bit differently. On the form, I added the numbers from 0 to 10 so that people could submit to those ones easily. After that, I also added an extra question for as many other numbers that people wanted to submit to. With this extra question, people submitted colors to over 1,000 different numbers. Going through over 1,000 different numbers and their colors in this video is a little bit much, especially when most of these numbers only got one submission. So I've decided to impose a couple restrictions. As a baseline for the entire form, I decided to ignore negative numbers and irrelevant decimals, focusing only on positive whole numbers and other relevant decimals. What constitutes a decimal number as relevant to me is if it has a distinct name. So submissions for numbers such as pi and tau were counted, while submissions for numbers such as 0.5 or 0.01 were discounted. I also imposed a couple more restrictions for each section of the video. For this first section, which will be covering each number's most submitted to color, I will only show you the majority color selected for every number as long as it follows two rules. Rule 1. This number's most selected color got at least 2 votes. Rule 2. The majority choice was not tied between 3 or more colors. With these two restrictions, we have 140 different numbers to cover. Most of these numbers only got like 5 to 10 submissions, so it would be pretty ridiculous to show the graph for every single one and talk about them all in depth, but I'm still going to show you the graph for the most submitted to numbers. Well, before we do that actually, if you remember the letters to colors video, you'll know that a large portion of the letters had their colors heavily influenced by the show Alphabet Lore. Unsurprisingly, the exact same thing happened with the numbers. This time, there were 2 central shows that dominated the color associations for the numbers. Number Blocks, which completely took over all of the single-digit numbers, and Battle for Dream Island, which dominated many of the other numbers while also influencing some of the single-digit numbers too. BFDI I expected would impact the results this way, as I know there's quite a bit of overlap with my audience and that audience, hi Carrie if you're watching this, but Number Blocks was surprising to me as I hadn't heard of this show before looking at the results of this poll. Both of these shows had over 100 people cite them and their reasoning for assigning colors to the numbers. Before we actually look into data affected by BFDI and Number Blocks, let's look into one number that was not, the number 0. 0 starts us off with all the grayscale colors getting highly selected, with black in first at 480 submissions, and white in second with 388 submissions. All 5 of the grayscale options were ever so close to being the top 5, but red actually beat out dark gray ever so slightly for 5th place. Unlike most of the other numbers dominated by BFDI and Number Blocks, the central reasoning for assigning a color to 0 was that as the absence of numbers, it was given a color that had the absence of hue, i.e. the grayscales. A lot of people also cited that they wish they could have chosen clear, transparent, or blank in their selection, but unfortunately I didn't give that option. The number 1 was red, not only because the Number Block 1 is red, but also because, as you've seen throughout this series, people have a tendency to give red to the first thing in a sequence, since it's the start of the rainbow, and well yeah, number 1 is the first number obviously. The number 2 wins with orange, although not without considerable effort from the BFDI fans to give it green. The blues are also fairly high here because, as discussed in the letters episode, people tend to view red, blue, yellow, and green as the 4 most important colors in that order, thus assigning them to the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 in that order. 3 wins with yellow evidently, with red and green rounding out the podium. Red is the BFDI crew, while green is high for, I honestly don't know, there weren't very many common reasons for this one. Then 4 wins with green, yada yada yada, it's Number Blocks again, you get the gist, blue in second because of BFDI, not much to report here. 5 wins with cyan, which also is not surprising, but what is surprising are the other top colors. The top BFDI color is purple, which actually makes sense why it's lower, since 5 isn't a character that appears in BFDI very often, but these 3 all above it don't have any good reason for why they were highly selected. Take note of orange in second place for the number 5. I'll come back to why that's interesting later on. For now though, let's move on to 6, which skips over blue and moves directly into purple. This one is also not particularly notable, apart from the fact that the entire top 5 is all spaced out evenly between cyan and purple, which makes this graph feel fairly satisfying. 7 is an interesting case because the number 7 in Number Blocks doesn't have a distinct color, it's a rainbow. Because the Number Block 7 doesn't have a distinct color, the number 7 ended up being the least agreed upon number from 0 to 10. This led to Dark Gray repping BFDI very nearly winning out, but the Number Block submissions ended up coming together to submit Violet, likely to bridge the gap between the purple 6 and the pink 8. Speaking of pink 8, yeah, the number 8 was pink. In second is gray, also nearly winning out from the BFDI submissions. Nothing else was particularly remarkable here. On to 9, which had dominance in the grayscales, as both BFDI and number blocks 9 is grayscale, which meant grayscale colors take up the entire podium. Again, not very much to comment on here, so let's move on. The last number I'm going to show in this graph format is the number 10, because it was the last number that had a distinct option on the form, winning with white. As per usual, the BFDI crew comes in second with orange. There was a decently sizable drop in submissions from 9 to 10, as a lot of people abstained because they didn't consider 10 to have its own color, it would just take on the colors of 1 and 0 instead. Here are all of the most chosen colors from 1 to 10, and here are all of the most chosen colors from 11 to 20. 5 of these numbers, 11, 13, 16, 18, and 19, match the individual color of the ones digit, but the other ones, 12, 14, 15, and 17, do not. For 12, 14, and 15, the BFDI submissions directly caused this, with 14 and 15 being especially high on dark green and dark red respectively. Over 40% of people gave dark green to 14 and dark red to 15. 17, on the other hand, ended up being different due to random chance. After all, 7 was already the single-digit number with the lowest agreement. Let's add in all of the rest of the 2-digit numbers. As stated earlier, numbers that are absent on this graph mean that number had 3 or more colors tied for first. In a lot of these cases, there were so few submissions for these numbers that no color ended up getting more than one submission. The flashing numbers indicate a two-way tie between colors for those numbers. There are 3 very interesting patterns with this data. The most notable of which is that apart from a couple of ties, the 50s unanimously ended up being orange. This is where 5's second most chosen color being orange comes into relevance. I have no idea why this ended up happening. It's not like a lot of people ended up giving orange to the 50s, so I find it fairly likely that this was just a coincidence, but it was still rather interesting that it happened. The second one was that the 40s ended up being green, apart from 42, which again is likely just coincidence. The last one, which most certainly was not a coincidence, was that the multiples of 10 ended up as lighter versions of the numbers from 1 to 10. There were 2 exceptions to this. The first one was 10, which was white, as already discussed, and the second one was 17, which was light purple, as there was no light violet option to submit, although that didn't discourage multiple people from attempting to submit it anyways. Those of you who attempted to submit light violet or many of the other invalid submissions, such as rainbow, goldenrod, transparent, candy cane, or even submitting 2 colors for a number, had your submissions for those numbers discarded. Let's look into some other numbers. The number 100 was red. The number 1000 was also red. Actually, almost all of the powers of 10 ended up as red, with the exceptions of 10,000 as blue, 1 million as yellow, and 1 quadrillion, which was tied between red and purple. This is all because there were 2 people on the form who submitted red for every single power of 10. Interestingly, 1 billion ended up being void because it somehow ended up with a 5-way tie. Some people also submitted colors for many of the powers of 2, in which a lot of them unfortunately ended up with too big of a tie. 128, 512, 1024, and 2048 all snag a shade of yellow due to the game 2048. 4096 ties between 2 shades of purple, 100, 31,072 ends up as light blue, and 1,073,741,824, also known as 2 to the power of 30, had 2 submissions, both of which were black, and the absolutely massive number of 2,147,483,648, otherwise known as 2 to the 31st power, had 2 submissions, both of which gave it red. Here are all of the rest of the 3-digit numbers that had distinct colors. The most notable ones are 420 as dark green because haha weed number, 666 as dark red because haha devil number, 456 as dark cyan because it's the number of the main character in Squid Game where they wear jackets of the same color, and 911 as red because it's the emergency number in North America. Here are the rest of the 4-digit numbers with distinct colors. There's not many of them, and they're a lot more interesting when I talk about the average colors, so I'll save the explanation for that section. Finally, the very last number that is non-irrational and doesn't have a distinct name, 299,792,458, also known as the speed of light, had 2 submissions, both of which gave it white, which I guess makes sense since white is literally the color of light. Next up, we have irrational numbers and other special numbers. The most submitted to irrational number was pi, which won with yellow-green. With 3 as yellow and 4 as green, it only makes sense that a number between them would get yellow-green. That didn't stop numerous people from submitting brown, orange, yellow-orange, and purple for the colors of the pi. That's right, the pi E. Pi E. E, otherwise known as Euler's constant, won with yellow, which is also the same as what the letter E got in the last video, so I think that may have impacted things. Tau won with sky blue, which notably is not the color in between the chosen colors for the numbers 6 and 7 like the value is, unlike how Pi's color was the color between 3 and 4. That wouldn't have really been an option though, since I didn't give a choice of a color between purple and violet. Incomprehensibly large numbers such as Google, Googleplex, and Infinity scored in the grayscales. Google and Infinity both scoring pure white, and Googleplex scoring pitch black. Also taking white is I, otherwise known as the imaginary unit. Two really blatantly obvious irrational numbers to color associations are phi, which got gold because it's, well, the golden ratio, and tree 3, which got dark green, aka the color of a tree. In the opposite direction, the square root of 2 ended up tying between pink and red pink for seemingly no discernible reason. Finally, these irrational numbers are the last ones to get colors, none of which I'm going to individually talk about because they all only won with either 2 or 3 votes, which isn't very interesting. Now, let's move on to averages. My restrictions for what numbers I would calculate the average color for were much more lenient. As long as a number had at least 3 submissions, I would calculate the average color. That's it, pretty easy to understand. Firstly, here are all of the numbers from 1 to 100. The numbers from 1 to 10 expectedly make some sort of rainbow, but the rainbow from 10 to 80 is significantly more satisfying. With the mode, we saw the 40s get mostly greens and the 50s get mostly oranges. This trend continues with the averages. Most of the 40s average out in the greens, and most of the 50s averaged out in the oranges, with a couple exceptions. Most of these colors are fairly dull, indicating low agreement between the average colors, but the numbers 66 and 68 stick out for being highly saturated violet and purple. This happened because, for these two numbers, not a single person submitted a color in this half of the rainbow. Here's the same swatch, organized in rainbow order in case that interests you. It's pretty nice, but there's definitely a lack of blues and an abundance of pinks. When we put this data into a scatter plot, the lack of blues and abundance of pinks becomes much more pronounced. There's also a high level of density in the yellow-orange region as well. The extremely high saturation of 66 and 68 stands out nicely here as well. 68's color especially is leagues above any of the other colors. The lowest saturated number ends up being, unsurprisingly, 0, followed close behind by 22 and 29. Let's go back to the grid from 1 to 100. I'm going to transfer this graph into a heat map to show you how many responses each number got. Boop! Numbers that are red, such as 11, 12, and 100 had the most color submissions for that number, while numbers that are blue, such as 76, 86, and 96, had the least color submissions for that number. There are some obvious patterns, such as 11 to 20, and multiples of 10 being more submitted to than most numbers, but there are some less obvious ones as well, such as the square numbers getting a bit more on average. Also getting more on average is 69 because of its status as a meme number. You'd think that 67 would also have more submissions as the new meme number, but this data was collected before 67 became a meme, so it stays low. Powers of 10 ended up averaging fairly consistently with a reddish-orange pukish color. A lot of numbers starting at 10 billion take on the exact same orange color. This is because there were 4 people who submitted the same exact color for all of the powers of 10, effectively into infinity. 2 people always on red, 1 always on yellow-orange, and 1 always on yellow. Any of these numbers that only had those 4 submissions and no one else just averaged out as that orange, which is all of the 10-something illions and 100-something illions past a billion. The powers of 2 all ended up as fairly pastelish colors, and from what I can tell, fairly often ended up pretty close to their respective colors in the game 2048. 512, 1024, and 2048 like obviously close to the yellows, but from what I can tell, 8192 is also a pinkish color, and 65,536 is a similar shade of blue? Not entirely sure on that though, since different apps seem to have extremely different colors for the higher numbers. Multiples of 10 followed a very distinct pattern with their colors. Did multiples of 100 follow suit? No. There wasn't really any rhyme or reason with these ones. I am quite fond of the 600 and 700 average colors though. How about multiples of 1000? Also no, and these ones only go up to 5000. I guess 3000 to 5000 ended up all being different shades of green at the very least. Some people also submitted colors for years in recent memory, meaning we have averages for some numbers spanning from 2013 to 2025. None of which have any rhyme or reason, but it is interesting to see these all be sort of grayed out, except for 2023, which is a violent shade of yellow-green. Some of the other highly submitted to 3 or more digit numbers include 101 with a pale orange, 111 with a grayish pink, 144 with gray, 360 with a light pink, 420 with bright green, 666 with dark red, 777 with a desaturated yellow, and 2763 with a purple tinged gray. As already stated, 420 was green because it's the weed number, and 666 was dark red as the devil's number. As for some of these other numbers, 777 ended up as a yellow because it represents winning the jackpot at a casino where I guess you win a lot of gold coins? I don't know, people didn't really explain this one in depth. 2,763 ended up getting a fairly significant number of submissions because it's an important number in BFDI, although it seems that all of these people literally only added it because of its significance in BFDI and not because they have an actual color association, because not a single person gave a reason for giving a color to 2,763, and the average color ended up being very grayed out. These other four numbers, I couldn't really find any agreed upon reason for their colors. Here are the entire rest of the numbers above 100, almost all of which only got between 3 to 5 submissions, so not exactly rigid data or anything, but still interesting enough in their own right. Here is yet another heat map showing how many submissions all these numbers got. 1000 effectively dwarfs every other number, though the powers of 2 up to 2048 and a handful of other random numbers did get a decent number as well. Now for irrational numbers and other number averages. Pi and E, despite being entirely separate entities, end up with almost the exact same average color. This sort of ugly pukish yellow. Their modes are much better indicators than this. Even more coincidentally, these ended up being the two most submitted to irrational numbers. After that, Phi pretty obviously is a shade of golden yellow, yet again since it's called the golden ratio. All three of I, Google, and Infinity had a majority on white, and all three of them have an average in the grayscales, with Infinity nearly being a pure gray, and Google and I leaning slightly more towards a yellow and blue hue respectively. Googleplex, on the other hand, was less grayscale and much darker. Tau takes a grayed out blue, which is essentially a more dull version of its most chosen color. The square root of 2 takes a salmon colored pink, and then we have all these other much less submitted to irrational numbers. Rayo's number and Tree 3 both take extremely vivid colors, while the other 4 are a bit more dulled out. Graham's number and Avogadro's constant both take a shade of blue similar to Tau's average. Omega nearly matches the pink from square root 2, and Euler's Mascheroni constant takes a slightly darker and more saturated form of the average colors for Pi and E. That's all the averages for all of the numbers that I could average for. Now it's time to look at the differences per country. Admittedly, when I first saw the results for this poll, I was kind of disappointed, and I expected that I wouldn't have anything to talk about when it came to differences in countries. After all, every single number from 1 to 10 had the same reason for their number 1 color, and the last time that happened, aka for days of the week, there just weren't any differences at all when combing through the data for each country. Thankfully, I was wrong, and the numbers data actually did have some interesting differences. Here are the most chosen colors for each number for the 6 most submitted to countries. Only the numbers 1 and 3 managed to be consistent across all 6 countries. 13, that's unlucky. Brazil and the Philippines most closely matched the overall data, both having exactly the same singular difference of 7 being purple instead of violet, which really isn't much of a difference at all. The UK was also exceptionally close, with its only difference being 4 as blue instead of green. The United States had 3 primary differences, which is surprising actually, considering it usually doesn't end up having any differences at all, making up half the dataset, but 5 ended up being orange, 7 ended up being dark gray, and 8 ended up being gray. Australia had 4 differences, although 8 and 9 weren't entirely different since they both tied between the majority color and another color. Canada though had quite a bizarre 7 differences, though 8 was also tied with the most common color. So, what does any of this mean? Why did any of this happen? Well, to be honest, it really just goes back to BFDI and number blocks again. In most cases, these differences were just the BFDI color winning out over the number blocks color. This is true for the differences in every number except for 5, because as stated previously, there is just something about the number 5 that is orange. I can't quite explain it. When it comes to averages for the countries, well, there isn't really that much difference between these submissions and the overall submissions. The most notable thing is that the Philippines colors are very, very highly saturated, since on average, they were much more likely to submit the number block colors. They're the only country to have an average color for 2 that is actually orange. The other most notable thing is that 0 for the United Kingdom is the closest anything has ever come in these averages across all of these videos to a pure gray, where all 3 RGB values are exactly identical. All 3 values ended up within less than 1 degree of each other, aka 1/3% of each other. Pretty wild. Out of the central 4 topics that I pulled for, the numbers data was actually the one that I was most interested in checking because a whole 12 years ago, Numberphile did a video on this exact subject. Even though he had significantly less data than I was expecting to collect, I was curious to see if the data would match up in any way. Obviously the answer is no, because number blocks was created only 9 years ago, and BFDI, while it did exist and was prevalent 12 years ago, did not introduce any of the number characters until also 9 years ago, with the start of BFB. That data was collected in a pre-BFDI, pre-number blocks world, while this one obviously was affected by those shows. That doesn't mean all is lost yet, because there is still a way to compare the two datasets. You see, I also added an option for people to select if they did have synesthesia on my form. The number file video was specifically about synesthesia, so those who answered that one are generally much more likely to have synesthesia, and those who clicked the synesthesia option on my form obviously do have synesthesia. So, does the data for the two groups of synesthetes match up? Not at all, unfortunately. In fact, the data for those who answered that they did have synesthesia in my poll actually basically matched the data for those who did not. Meanwhile, almost all of the number file averages ended up in the greens, which is another issue entirely. Ultimately, what this means to me is that the data I collected is kind of invalid, unfortunately. Either a lot of people who selected the option saying that they had synesthesia actually do not, hence the averages being the same as the averages of those who cited number blocks, or there's something else to synesthesia and color association that is out of the scope of what this video is meant to be. Ah well. Finally, we end yet again with the last question on the form. What is your favorite number? A lot of different numbers ended up being different people's favorites. Let's go through the top 10. In 10th place was 13 with 35 submissions. Tied in 9th and 8th place are Pi and 9, both of which got 37 submissions. In 7th place is 6 with 38 submissions. In 6th place is 12 with 41 submissions. In 5th place is 3 with 49 submissions. In 4th place is 5 with a very satisfying 55 submissions. Shame it was one away from lining up in 5th place as well. And our podium, in 3rd place is 4 with 66 submissions. In 2nd place is 8 with 69 submissions. And our grand winner with a whopping 103 submissions is 7. Here's a heat map of all of the numbers from 1 to 100 and how many submissions they got, because I just love stuffing this video with as many heat maps as possible. It's mostly lower numbers that are typically in consideration for being a favorite, but notable larger 2-digit numbers, 42, 64, and 69, are generally higher than their surroundings. Here are all of the rest of the numbers that got at least 2 submissions. Most of them didn't get very many, apart from 3 standouts. Pi, as already stated, amassed 37 submissions. 2,763, the BFDI number, amassed 30 submissions, and 0 got 18. Well, that is the end of this series. For now, at least. Maybe I'll revisit it sometime in the future, but definitely not anytime soon. I need a break from this. I really enjoyed getting the chance to do this, and I really hope you all enjoyed seeing all of the data. I've been getting a lot of comments asking, how can I participate in the next form, so I wanted to address that here. Whenever I announce a form to submit, it's in the form of a YouTube video with a link to the form in the description. Unfortunately, due to the way that the internet works, I can't leave this form open for longer than a week out of concern for people just breaking the form in some way. I've seen it happen in the past and I don't want to take that risk. What this means is if you want to ensure that you know when a form happens, genuinely the best way to do so is to subscribe to me and turn on notifications. Like, I'm not even saying that because hee hee haha YouTuber wants subscribers. I say that because it's the most surefire way for you to ensure that you will know when I post a form, and there will be more forms in the future. I really like doing these sorts of things. And now that my audience is growing, there's a larger sample size to analyze things. In fact, there's actually going to be another form posted a week from the day that this video is posted. Yeah, I'm doing another form. Be excited about that. This one is going to be on a completely unrelated topic to these color association videos and function very differently. But still, you'll have the chance to directly contribute to one of my videos and potentially even be a part of it, so stay tuned for that. See you later!